the dominant attitude has been that tradition is an evolving reality in the life of the church. This is the great 19th and 20th century argument, that tradition has from the beginning a kernel of truth in it that grows and develops over time, and the church comes to more and more appreciation of that kernel of truth in the tradition. And this idea really develops in the 19th and 20th century as modern historical scholarship shows that what Rome claimed were apostolic traditions going back to the first century cannot possibly be first century practices or doctrines. And so then this idea of evolving tradition becomes the great defense of Rome. The problem is, of course, when you go back and read Trent, and even read the statement on tradition in the First Vatican Council in the middle of the 19th century, they clearly say tradition is purely what the apostles themselves taught in the first century. And so this evolving tradition eases a lot of consciences in Rome, but in my judgment, it really contradicts what is said both at Trent and in Vatican I. What Rome often does, in my judgment again, is to go back into the historical record, the writings of the Church Fathers, and cherry pick quotations that support their later definitions, whether at the Fourth Lateran Council in the Middle Ages or the Council of Trent. And you can find in relatively early fathers rather strong statements about bread and wine being the body and blood of Christ. The problem is that when you look at the fathers more broadly, you find that that language is often used in a rather ambiguous sort of way. It's not used in a crystal clear, defined theological definition. So there is language that might be read in a later Roman way, but might also be read in a Lutheran way or a Reformed way. And the actual notion that the elements are changed from bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ is very hard to substantiate in the early writers. And so Rome doesn't really embrace the idea of a consensus fidelium. It doesn't really ask what was the broad teaching of the church as a whole in that period. In my judgment, it goes back and just tries to look for things that agree with it and then say, well, that was what the church as a whole believed. And if you try to argue then, well, it's not what the church as a whole believed, then their response is, well, it's what the Orthodox Church believed. Namely, really reading out of the church those that don't agree with Rome's later position. And the problem is, of course, that you have to read out people like Augustine, who rather clearly didn't say what Rome says about the Lord's Supper. Now then Rome regroups and says, well, because we didn't have an exhaustive definition of that, we don't want to read those people out. Well, you can't sort of have it both ways, that what we say about the Eucharist is what the church has always believed, and then have to say, except that there were great doctors of the church who didn't actually believe that. So Rome is very adept at being light-footed. It moves around, and people who don't know much about church history, it can be very impressive. But I think on the merits of the case, you sort of have to be willing to grant that Rome must be right before her historical arguments become at all convincing.